Hello humans, it's just Martine and welcome to a very chill June reading stats video. Right off the bat, I want to apologize for any noises that you hear in the background. My family is home today, they're doing their thing, and that's not going to slow me down. So let's talk about all the reading that I got done in the month of June. The reason you're about to see some of the statistics that you are about to see and or hear is because of two things. One, I went on a road trip with my family in the month of June and I had a lot of reading time while I was away. And then two, Wonderathon happened, and so I also did plenty of reading, and some of the reading that I did was of very short works. And so some of these numbers are going to seem ridiculous, and trust me, I did read a ridiculous amount, but the number of books to number of pages ratio is maybe like not what it would be if it was truly insane, because again, there were several short stories, but we'll talk more about that in a bit. Let's start by giving you the lowdown on the number of books that I read. It was 87, which was still a lot even if you took out the short stories or like grouped them together. Like, I still read a lot of regular sized books. We can see that I still did a ton of reading based on the number of pages that were in these books that I finished, which was 19,199, which is about 9,000 pages more than a usual month for me. So almost doubled my number of pages read. Based on this number, my average number of pages read per day should have been around 639.967, but based on the way that books came in and out of the month, it was actually 336 pages on average per day, which is still insane. Trust me. Now let's talk about how much time that took to read. As a reminder, my most successful reading month this year so far was about 140 hours worth of reading. In the month of June, I read for 196 hours, 0.317, which means that on average per day, I spent 6.5 hours reading, which is about 2 more hours on average than my best reading month so far. There were like several days where I was just sitting in the car, reading was the only thing I was doing, and then some big Wonderathon days. There were a couple days I got over 1,000 pages read in a day, so that obviously took a great deal of time. On the last day of Wonderathon, I read for 12 hours, so that's where several of those hours are coming from. So thank you, Wonderathon, for lighting a fire, as you always do. That said, how was I reading on those days? Interestingly enough, eyeball reads are usually 100% of the days in a month, but this month I only read with my eyeballs for 29 out of the 30 days, so 97% of the days, because I was trying to finish up books before Wonderathon and have like kind of a clean slate for Wonderathon, and it got to the point where the only book I was still in the middle of, with a whole day left before the readathon began, was an audiobook. So I only listened to an audiobook that day, didn't read with my eyeballs at all, which was so weird. And then number of earball days was 19 out of 30, so 63%, which is not like the most earball reading days I've ever had in a month, but I was listening. And then here's where you can tell how short some of the books were, and also like how much I was reading in a day, because my average days to read a book was 1.068. So it took about a day on average to read a book. I will tell you, so many of those came up as it took 0 days to read in my spreadsheet, because if you put the start date and the end date as the same day, it calculates it as 0 days because it didn't take you a full day to read. Anyway, numbers. Let's get into the juicy stuff, the graphs, the breakdown of what those 87 books looked like. We'll start, as always, with genre. This one's interesting. So last year in Wonderathon, there were still team genres, but they were really de-emphasized. And this year, one of the changes was that the team genres mattered a lot for points. Like, you got 10 extra points per book that was within your genre. On Team Rome, our genre was mystery, thriller, horror, basically all the spooky stuff. And so you can see that the two largest chunks of my pie were mystery and thriller. And this is kind of good, because I always say that like one of my most read genres is mystery, because last year when I was doing all my stats for the first time, mystery came out as my top read genre. And this year, for some reason, fantasy was in the lead like all up until June, and so I'm really happy to report that this month's reading of mystery and thrillers has knocked fantasy far off from first place, and we are now soundly where we like to be, because fantasy is not my favorite genre, so I should not be reading the most fantasy. Other big categories, I have this pretty big slice of romance, 13.8% of my books. I will say that's largely from the first half of the month, pre-Wonderathon. Because I recently got my Kindle, I got 3 months of KU, and so I've been reading a lot of romance over on KU, because what are the recommendations people usually give for KU? They're romance books. And I also knew that I'd be reading a lot of mystery and thrillers in the second half of the month, so I really focused on other genres in the first part of the month. There are also lots of other things. There's some dystopian, some fantasy, some magical realism, some paranormal, a poetry collection, a little bit of sci-fi. Oh, and several contemporaries, again, partially from before Wonderathon, but then also there were several during Wonderathon that were just like so quick that I took the L on the genre bonus and read them. But yeah, mystery thriller showed up in the month of June. For some comparison, I've now read 25 fantasy books this year, so that was in the lead, but now I've read 48 mystery books this year, so that's solidly above it now, which is, again, kind of a relief. And 31 of those mystery books were in this month. I read over 50 mystery and thrillers combined this month. Looking at fiction versus nonfiction, I read a whole one nonfiction book, and that was actually the audiobook that I listened to that day. That was my earball only day. So nothing much to see here, largely fiction. This means that the percent nonfiction for my reading was about 1%, whereas for the year, about 7% of my reading in total has been nonfiction reading. So for book size, my smallest book was Murder at the Royal Ruby, which was 27 pages long, and my longest one was not that long. So whereas in the month of May, I finished the longest book that I've read all year, you should go check that out if you haven't seen it already. This month, my longest book was only 464 pages, and it was titled Creatures by Shannon McGuire. This meant that my average pages per book was 220.68, which is almost 200 pages lower than my average pages per book last month was. Book size in general, it's funny, we only had the smaller medium category. Usually my reading is broken into 4 categories: small, medium, large, and chunky. We only had small and medium books this month, so nothing over 500 pages. We had a lot of small books, 53 of them. Again, many a short story came in clutch during this, and several novellas as well. Still a good number of medium books, so this is anywhere between 300 and 500 pages. And honestly, this is how you know it was a good reading month, regardless of how many really short things I read. Because if you have a month where you say, I read 34 books that were between 300 and 500 pages, that's still an incredible reading month. My reading months are never that good. For star ratings, almost half of this pie is 4 stars. In general, I had a really good time. I will say that by the second week of Wonderathon, I feel like my ratings were slipping a bit just because I was like tired of reading. I would still say that I'm very pleased with this distribution, because way more than half the books were between 4 and 5 star reads for me, and my average rating this month was 3.7, which is the same as it was in May. So even though I read a lot more, I was still enjoying things about as well as I did in May, which is good to know, you know? And finding 5 5-star books is nothing to scoff at. For series versus standalone, I read 65.5% series. A lot of this is because of the short stories and novellas I read, because I grouped collections as series, but then also in general, a lot of the mysteries that I was reading were series. Like I relied on a lot of Joanne Fluke. Those were all in series together. That's the main example I can think of. And so only about 34.5% of them were standalone. Oh, also another reason for series is because a lot of those KU romances are series. And a lot of the things that I'm reading on KU in general are parts of series, like the Edge of Collapse series, the Marionette series. Even though those aren't romance series, they are series on KU. So lots of series. Because there were a lot of series that I read, a lot of these authors ended up in the read before category, even if prior to this month I had never read them before. For instance, Dean Koontz is counted in the new to me slice of this pie 1 time, and then counted in the read before slice 5 more times. If you read a lot of series, you're going to end up with a lot of authors that you've read from before. That's just how it is. For type of publishing, I think this is honestly the most interesting thing that has changed from my reading in previous months, and I think it's largely because of KU, although not entirely. Some of my library books fit into this category. So this is type of publishing, right? And still the majority of my reads were traditionally published works. So either from one of the like big five companies or from one of their imprints. So 72.4% traditionally published, but 26.4% of them seemed to be, from all of my research, independently published, which is a crazy amount. And again, this was not just even all KU. I had several library books that when I looked up their publisher, I was like, that's not a big publisher. And some of them were named like America's biggest independent publisher. And I was like, look, it's an indie publisher. I'm counting it. And then I read one truly self-published book that I could find. So publication date was also pretty interesting. Majority of them were backlist books, which just makes sense. More books are from years before 2023 than are from 2023 to 2024. But I did still read a good amount of really new works. So 11.5% of my reads were from 2023. So last year, this was 10 books. And then a whopping 29.9% of my reads were 2024 releases. That's 26 2024 releases that I read in the month of June. That's so many. I would like to thank my libraries for this because that's where those new release books came from. All of them. All 26 2024 releases were library books. So we love a library. For age range, most of them were adult books, but I did read a hefty chunk of YA and children's books as well. So 14.9% of my reads were children's books. This was 13 of them. And then 16.1% of the reads were YA books. I will say the interesting thing about the children's and YA one are that the main reason that I read children's books and YA books for the majority of Wonderathon was because of the science path. The science path was this flowchart. You had to do prompts in order and go like a certain direction. And the path that I followed the most went like audiobook, middle grade / YA, and then read a book that was a TBR vet that had a romance. And so I was reading a lot of audiobooks that were YA and middle grade because that was always the first way that I went on the flowchart. So that's where a lot of these came from. Let's see, format. I largely read ebooks. All hail the Kindle. I packed very few books with me, and the ones that I did pack, I mostly didn't read. Oops. So most of these were ebooks, 66.7%. So 2/3 of my reads were on the Kindle. I did read many in audiobook. 25.3% of my reads were audiobooks. And then I had a really slim percentage of physical books because I read 3 physical books. And then I read 4 books in a mixture. All of the books that were a mixture were audiobook and ebook at the same time. They were from the last day of Wonderathon when I had not a singular brain cell left. Time was running down. I was trying to read as quickly as humanly possible. And so I was listening to audiobooks while reading the ebooks. And those were Dean Koontz short stories that are on KU or through like Amazon Prime that you can read and listen to at the same time. Like there's an Audible thing included. So that was mixture. How did I acquire these books? Largely Libby and KU. 54% of them were Libby. Usually more of it is Libby, but again, since I have KU for a few months, I'm really trying to make the most of it. So 37.9% of my reads were from KU. 33 books from KU. Again, many a short story, but still. I did read a couple of owned ebooks, which was a victory for me, and then 3 owned books, which is like, you know, it could be better. Those are all the graphs. Let's talk about some other fun statistics. Personally, my favorite subject to talk about in terms of books per month is money. So in the month of June, I acquired 15 books, but I only spent $1.25 of my own money on this. This is for a couple of reasons. One, the majority of the books that I obtained in the month of June were from this used bookstore, where really the purpose is that this guy has been collecting books for like his whole life and he needs to get rid of them. And so my family went and we got like a huge stack of books. And he was like, okay, $35. And so my dad paid him $35 and we took all our books. And so many of my books came from that. I got a couple from free little libraries. I got several from a used bookstore in town that we have credit with. So I just used the credit, not real money. And then I did buy one Dollar Tree book. That's the $1.25. So let's talk about how much money I saved using the library. As you might remember, I read like 47 library books this month. So surely I saved a ton of money. And That is correct, because in the month of June, I saved $707.68 by reading books from my library, which is nuts. And it brings my total for the year up to $2,516.03 of savings from the library. In terms of goals, my Goodreads goal for the year is always 52 books. I have now read 242, so I am at 465% of my goal. I'm also trying to read 24 owned books this year, and I've read 21 of them, so I'm at 87.5% of this goal. And finally, I'm trying to read 24 owned ebooks. I'm at 14 of this goal, so I'm at 58.33%. So that was the month of June. It was kind of crazy, very different, I think, from how my stats normally look, I would say. So pretty interesting to look back on and remember why my reading was the way that it was. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below how was your reading month in June, and do you have any fun reading plans for July, and subscribe for more bookish and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!